Welcome back, horror fans, cinephiles, and giallo enthusiasts. This is Tanner Leeser, your host for all things giallo, here on The King in Giallo. Our next stop on our journey through giallo cinema is the second giallo film from Luigi Bazzoni, The Fifth Chord, released in 1971. Here is The Fifth Chord Overview. The Fifth Chord is an Italian production directed by Luigi Bazzoni, who also co-wrote the film along with Mario Fanelli and Mario de Nardo, based upon a novel by David MacDonald Devine. Music is composed by Ennio Morricone. The cast is made up of Franco Nero as Andrea Bild, Silvia Monti as Helena, Wolfgang Preiss as the inspector, Pamela Tiffin as Lou, Edmund Perdum as Eduard Vermont, Rossella Falk as Sofia Bini, Renato Romano as Dr. Richard Bini, Ira Fürstenberg as Isabel Lancia, Maurizio Bonuglia as John Lubbock, Guido Alberti as Traversi, Agostini Belli as Giulia, and Corrado Gaipa as the editor. The plot follows Andrea, a journalist who is down on his luck to the point of debilitating alcoholism as he tries to fix things with his estranged wife, Helena, but after a series of murders are enacted against some acquaintances of his, he becomes a suspect to the police. Solving these murders becomes an opportunity for Andrea to get the story of a lifetime and save his career, and so he does some snooping on his own. The killer reaches out to the reporter, warning him against his amateur pursuit, but Andrea stays the course, compromising the safety enjoyed by his wife and kid. I've said it before, and I will say it again. Luigi Bazzoni is one of the most underappreciated directors in this genre. Some of you will remember him from The Possessed, 1965, which I ranked as my personal favorite giallo film of the 1960s. In the case of The Fifth Chord, he does not disappoint. The film remains one of the most perfect giallo films and is utterly stylish and gorgeous, a quintessential classic. The film perfectly combines color, decor, and framing to deliver some images which embody the cinematic phrase stating that every frame should be a picture. Franco Nero takes one of the most cliched and stock characters in the detective genre and makes him endearing and unique thanks to his charming yet sincere performance. The character arc is treated with respect and demands your investment thanks to the combined works of both its actor, Franco Nero, as well as its writer and director, Luigi Bazzoni. The two had already worked together recently, but on a spaghetti western, Man, Pride, Vengeance, 1968, a western version of Carmen by Prosper Merimea, co-starring Klaus Kinski. The killer's motivation in the film is rather cliched in hindsight, but amazingly, as I have gone through these gialli mostly in chronological order of their release dates, the cliched reason for the killings this film utilizes has yet to be applied or has very sparingly been used. Over the next years, though, it will become one of the most common motivations. Some gorehounds will be detracted at the lack of on-screen splattery violence and buckets of blood, but Bazzoni more than makes up for this by having some of the greatest and most tense scenes ever put together in giallo. In fact, I talk about how this giallo film, above all others, contains the only scene in the entire genre which actually had me on the edge of my seat, scared for what was about to happen. Cinematographer Vittorio Storaro suggests that Luigi Bazzoni took on the project more so as it was the big thing to do this season, as the genre was in fashion, but amazingly, the film does not come off as a director who simply was cashing in on the hot trend. Storaro wonderfully employs light and shadow to set the mood and craft some haunting settings. The character scenes laden with dialogue are also remarkably well-paced and engaging. In a genre where its fans typically accept that the majority of the films will shamble from one exciting set piece to the next, kind of like a Godzilla movie where you're not interested in the human plot, this giallo defies this expectation. These sequences hold our attention, and the tense moments later on are thus enhanced all the more thanks to the film's captivation of our interest. We care about these characters. Helping to bring the visual elements in line even more is the fantastic score by the maestro Ennio Morricone. The music ranges from being cool and jazzy to discordant and uneasy. Morricone was truly on fire at this time, although Argento had his qualms. Franco Nero was born in 1941, began appearing in photo novels, then debuted on screen in the early 1960s. He burst into the starlight with his titular character in the 1966 spaghetti western classic Django, directed by Sergio Corbucci. Nero would star in numerous more westerns, including The Mercenary, but also international pictures such as The Bible, In the Beginning, 1966 by John Huston, and Camelot, 1967 by Joshua Logan. He would also seep his way into the more art house European flicks such as A Quiet Place in the Country, 1968 by Elio Petri, which, by the way, I have seen listed as being a proto-giallo film in some circles, and I will be going back to cover this film in some way, shape, or form, but I digress. As well as that film, Nero also appeared in Tristana, 1970 by Louis Buñuel. Despite dabbling in giallo and being the face of the most iconic Italian Western character, Nero would grow to dominate the poliziesque crime genre of Italian cinema during this decade. Nero's proficiency for portraying a softer side against his rugged exterior made him a hit with audiences. The Django legend would make a brief cameo in the 2012 Quentin Tarantino film, Django Unchained, and I cannot say how many times I've had to tell people that that is the original Django, and they are baffled. Now, Troy Howarth points out that Nero had appeared in several early films, which are often miscategorized as being proto-gialli, but in his estimation, they are not. These include The Third Eye, 1966 by Mino Guerrini, Un Detective, 1969 by Romolo Guerrieri, and the aforementioned A Quiet Place in the Country by Elio Petri. Nero would make another giallo appearance several decades later in Bad Inclination, 2003. Princess Ira Fürstenberg returns to the genre after appearing in Five Dolls for an August Moon, 1970 by Mario Bava, which shares a screenwriter with The Fifth Chord, Mario Di Nardo. Silvia Monti was in A Lizard in a Woman's Skin, 1971 by Lucio Fulci. Renato Romano was in The Bird with the Crystal Plumage, 1970 by Dario Argento. Rossella Falk was in Run Psycho Run, 1968 by Brunello Rondi. And Wolfgang Preiss would appear later this year in The Blood-Stained Butterfly, 1971 by Duccio Tessari. Agostina Belli would go on to appear in Double Murder, 1977 by Marcello Mastroianni. Luigi Bazzoni will go on to direct one more giallo film, the wildly psychological and nightmarish Footprints on the Moon, 1975, starring Florinda Balkan with Klaus Kinski. Another movie Howarth doesn't consider to be a giallo, but we disagree. But I digress. On to the review. Spoilers ahead for those of you who haven't yet seen the film. You've been warned. My prediction for the movie's GialliTally score. The film, based off of my recent viewing, does seem to have more cliches, I noticed right off the bat, but not in abundance that makes me think that we will have a new giallo in the top 3 spot. I'll say more than last time though, so let's go with 650 to 700 points. Well, let's begin the GialliTally and review portion of the video. Beginning, as always, with the previewing cliches. The repeat offenders are 1 point for actor, 3 for writer, 3 for composer, and 5 for director. Franco Nero was in A Quiet Place in the Country, 1 point. Silvia Monti was in A Lizard in a Woman's Skin, 1 point. Ira von Fürstenberg was in 5 Dolls for an August Moon, 1 point. Rossella Falk was in Black Belly of the Tarantula and Run Psycho Run, 2 points. Renato Romano was in The Iguana with the Tongue of Fire, The Bird with the Crystal Plumage, and Death Laid an Egg, 3 points. Corrado Gaipa was in The Man with Icy Eyes, 1 point. Maurizio Bonuglia was in Yellow Le Cugina and Top Sensation, 2 points. Luigi Bazzoni wrote The Possessed, 3 points. Mario Di Nardo wrote $5 for an August Moon, 3 points. Ennio Morricone composed for Four Flies on Grey Velvet, The Black Belly of the Tarantula, The Cold Eyes of Fear, The Cat o' Nine Tails, A Lizard in a Woman's Skin, The Forbidden Photos of a Lady Above Suspicion, The Bird with the Crystal Plumage, Vergogna Schifosi, and A Quiet Place in the Country. 27 points. And Luigi Bazzoni directed The Possessed, 5 points. Cliché points for the title, The Fifth Chord, contains a number, 5th, 5 points. First look, 25 points for the Italian director, and an additional 15 points for the movie releasing during the golden age of giallo cinema, and 15 points for this being a quintessential giallo film. And would you look at that, it is Pilato Clock. After we are informed who is presenting the movie, it fades in on an audio recorder being played back of a distorted voice, giving us the date, with the individual stating that they are not a murderer, not yet. I want to point out how much better the Italian dub is already, as I knew this scene would be more effective in the original Italian than the English. And I am right. As the voice continues, we follow a person into a restaurant or nightclub. Oh, by the way, cold open, 5 points. Audio recording device, 5 points. First person POV of the killer, 5 points. And POV, killer's identity is hidden due to the framing and editing, 2 points. The voice explains that they have already planned their victims, and they ponder why they are keeping a diary in the first place, regardless of them altering the voice, as if this is sufficient as to not be found out. 5 people will die in the next year. O is for obsession. Extra points for the killer being obsessed. 10 points. I never give that one right away. That's usually one for after the movie has ended. I'd say Poltergeist reference, but this is 11 years before that movie came out. Gratuitous 1970s dancing, 2 points. The intro ends with a child screaming, then silence, and then the opening music begins. This is our protagonist, Andrea, sulking at the bar. I will do my best to set up the characters right away as Andrea looks around and observes. Isabel Lancia dancing with Eduard Vermont. This is Dr. Riccardo Bini. This woman glaring from the bar is his crippled wife, Sophia. Hey man, just because she's invalid doesn't mean she's invalid. F is for fashion, 5 points. Andrea sees Sophia sitting across the way, and realizing that they seem to be kindred spirits tonight, toasts to her. Eduard sees Helena, the woman Andrea was previously romantically involved with before his alcoholism pushed her away, and then he toasts to her, introducing Isabel, to which Helena congratulates the both of them. They're getting married, don't you know? This bummed fellow off to the side is John Lubbock. As Andrea gets up, perchance to leave, he sees the doctor and his upset wife, Helena dancing with another man, and Eduard and Isabel being romantic, and a spurned John Lubbock who watches them. Necking, 5 points. The lovers individually stare daggers into John. First Isabel, and then Eduard. Looks like we got a love triangle. John dismisses himself into the bathroom, where he seems to be having a panic attack as the sounds of the new year are ushered in the background. The partygoers are leaving now, and we follow Helena into her car, but she is not alone. Andrea waits for her in the passenger seat, looking like a kid waiting in the car for his mom to come back from the bank before driving off to their errands they have. Helena is rightfully bothered by Andrea's presence, calling him out for playing games and for going against their agreement, to which he states that, yeah, well, I forget things when I drink, then starts to caress her hair. She shoots back, saying that she has not been drinking. She kicks him out, and I do find humor in the notion that he really thought any of that was going to work with her. Don't you know the ladies love a depressed and desperate drunkard? Back in his car, Andrea polishes off a bottle on his way home. Nothing quite says the 70s like drinking and driving. Do not drink and drive, by the way. J is for J&B, extra points for it being drunk, 10 points, and this is the best usage of J&B in giallo in my opinion. C is for children, 5 points. This is Tony, Helena's child. We cut over to the doctor and his wife, who both seem to be on the rocks tonight. Cut again over to Isabel Lancia and Eduard, still out and enjoying the evening. They part ways. John Lubbock is walking home. He walks under a bridge, passing these two lovebirds, Walter and Julia, and enters through a dark tunnel. As he trudges through, paranoia seems to grip him, and he turns to look back. He continues. Nearing the other side, John stops to look back once more. This time he is ambushed and assaulted by a mysterious person who beats him to the ground. The lovers stop immediately and Walter rushes to investigate. The assailant flees before anything else can happen. Walter sees them run and gives chase. Foot chase, 5 points. Z is for zoom, 5 points. Cut to much later at Andrea's home. A ringing phone is heard, waking up our hungover protagonist. It is apparent that he has a woman there with him, a mistress. Her name is Lou, and she explains how someone has tried to call 3 times, how she waited up for hours for Andrea last night, but when he came home, he was too drunk to do anything, and she laments whether she is his maid or part-time lover. Unsure as of now if she really is his maid, or if that was just playful banter. She expresses wanting more from him in this new year. Communication couldn't hurt. He tries to eat her face and smothers her with his mustache. The phone interrupts their smooch session. Andrea answers it. T is for telephone, 5 points. His boss is on the line, and it is urgent that Andrea come in. Andrea walks through the office, passing an astrological-obsessed secretary who warns him about the day. Thanks, co-star. Andrea goes into his boss's office, who is chief editor. R is for reporter. Extra points for him being an amateur sleuth. 10 points. His boss, Traversi, tells Andrea of the incident earlier and how he sent Vogel over to the hospital to get the story. Andrea asks about the couple who discovered John, but they haven't been identified yet, so Andrea leaves to find out who they are. Outside, Andrea runs into Vogel. The latter shows him his story thus far. Andrea corrects pieces of it, stating that, for one, John is not English, as Vogel's story says, but Australian. Also, that the school where he is employed, Grove, has no permanent staff or supply teachers, as Vogel misassociated Lubbock with. Andrea says that their staff at Grove comes and goes. Spiral staircase scene, 5 points. Inside the hospital now, a nurse tells Andrea that no one, not even reporters, are permitted to see John Lubbock. However, Andrea runs into Dr. Beanie, who tells Andrea that Lubbock has a fractured 4th cervical. Outside again, Andrea now passes Inspector Haller, who tells him that the crime is being treated as an assault with intent of robbery. Andrea asks if he can speak with the couple who found Lubbock. He protests some, but caves and tells Andrea that the woman is Giulia Soavi, and she lives near the tunnel, and that the man is Walter, the brother of Andrea's mistress, Lou. Lastly, he informs Andrea that he will need to make himself available for future questioning because he was one of the last people to see John prior to his assault. In this dilapidated building, Andrea finds Julia. She refuses to talk to him, however. An older gentleman appears to be inside, overhearing the conversation. When Andrea presses her to talk with him, she threatens to call her father out, and so he leaves. Julia watches from the window as Andrea goes until her father calls her back. Andrea returns home, finds that Lou has gone, but that she has left him a note stating that she will be gone until Tuesday, that she took some money, and that she does not care if Andrea cheats on her while she is away. Sounds like a modern couple to me. Over at Helena's awesome house now, Andrea rings her outside, trying to apologize. She hastily accepts it, but he asks if he can come inside. After a while, she relents. Cut to Andrea tossing a ball with Tony. He comes inside and remarks how much Tony has grown. He further remarks about a photo of Helena's ex-husband. She corrects him and says that she and him are not officially divorced yet, and he mocks her for wanting to remember that she has such a wealthy husband. He comments on how so much has changed in the past year. He tries to hit on her again, but she calls him out for being impossible when he drinks. She tells him to cut the crap. Why are you here? Jump forward. Andrea has been allowed to stay for the moment, and Helena asks him what he wants to know about John Lubbock. He says everything she knows. She tells him, well, he's 26, born in Sydney, and has been teaching at the Grove for about 2 months, which covers his university fees. He's lonely, shy, and introverted. He goes to concerts and plays tennis. Exposition dumping, 2 points. She explains how John is her friend and that she suspects that he fell for Isabel and was suffering last night because Isabel is marrying John's friend, Eduard. We watch as Dr. Beanie observes John Lubbock leave the hospital in a neck brace. Back at the doctor's home, Sophia buzzes for her husband. Art featured, 5 points. She requests water. Animal featured, cat, 2 points. She asks if her husband Ricardo will stay the night with her, but he says he must go. But tomorrow. Sophia kisses him passionately, but the phone rings, and Dr. Beanie is summoned at once to an urgent house call. Alone for some time, Sophia resorts to blasting organ music and having a cig. Honorary cliché, smoking in bed. After some time, the cat runs out of the bedroom, and Sophia assumes Ricardo must be back. She calls out to him, but receives no answer. Suddenly, the lights go out. Then the phone rings. Sophia pulls herself to the end of the bed, but when she attempts to get in her wheelchair, she loses it and it skirts out of the room. Sophia falls to the floor and crawls after her chair, but once in the other room, her wheelchair seems to have vanished. The phone rings again, and Sophia has to drag herself across the room to answer it. She ascends to the table, but the phone is now gone too. E is for eyeballs, 5 points. She reaches the landing and screams out to Ricardo. Y is for yelling, extra points for a hysterical woman yelling, 10 points. She rises to her feet, but is attacked from behind. G is for gloves, 5 points. The gloved assailant chokes Sophia until she is unconscious, then tosses her over the landing, where she crashes onto the stairs, dead. We watch as the body is carted off. The inspector meets with Andrea and tells him that Dr. Beanie was called out of the house by a phone call which turned out to be a hoax, that the address given did not exist, and that Dr. Beanie discovered his wife dead upon his return home. Inspector Haller confirms with Andrea that he is also one of the doctor's patients. Andrea also tells him that the doctor was known to leave the door unlocked in case patients needed to pick up prescriptions. The inspector asks if he knew Sophia Beanie, but Andrea says not that well. Q is for questions, 5 points. The inspector shows a photograph taken the night of the New Year's party, showing Andrea sitting and talking with Sophia. Haller then inquires about Eduard, and Andrea tells him that the man teaches French over at the Grove. Before heading into the station, the inspector asks Andrea who else might have overheard during the party that John Lubbock said that he was going to walk home alone. Extra points for Z is for zoom, for a zoom on eyes, 5 more points. In a flashback, Andrea recalls John declining a ride home from Helena, then Eduard and Isabel running up to say goodbye to everyone. Protecting Helena, Andrea says no one else knew John was walking home alone. L is for lies, 5 points. He does inform the inspector that Dr. Beanie was nearby, though. When asked what he did after the party, Andrea says that he does not remember because of his drunkenness and admits that he doesn't have an alibi. He theorizes whether the doctor might have faked the phone call, but the inspector asserts that Dr. Beanie has a sound alibi, that he was at a friend's house last night. A is for alibi, 5 points. Andrea asks who the friend is. Eduard Vermont. The inspector then gets Andrea to confess that Lou was not home last night, and so despite Andrea saying that he was up until 3 a.m. writing, that he doesn't have someone to corroborate his alibi for last night. Next, the inspector shows Andrea a piece of evidence left behind at the crime scene. A black glove with a finger missing. Extra points for G is for gloves, for it being black. 5 more points. Andrea makes the connection that there was also a glove left at the crime scene of John Lubbock's assault, but the inspector determines that the finger cut off implies 1 victim down and 4 more to go. Odd clue, 5 points. That's kind of convenient that he figured that out, almost like the script demanded it. Andrea calls up Dr. Beanie, then meets with him. Ricardo tells him openly that he is not bothered by his wife's passing because she'd been a corpse these past 2 years anyway. He states that he is happy to set the record straight, prompting Andrea to inform him that he was actually instructed not to interview the doctor. Ricardo says to cut the crap. What does Andrea want? He simply asks if the voice on the phone who called last night was a man's or a woman's. Ricardo says he could not tell. They sounded like they suffered from laryngitis. Ricardo asserts that only a patient of his could have known about his habits of leaving the doors unlocked to the degree that they could have entered his house. Through a rapid-fire line of questioning, Ricardo answers what the address given was, that he assumed he'd gotten the address wrong, and rather than return home, he visited his friend who lives on the same street, Edouard Vermont. Ricardo dismisses himself, having a prior engagement elsewhere, but Andrea tails him to a restaurant where he spies the doctor handing cash over to a young man. The man? Walter Auer. Andrea watches Walter exit and observes him getting into a car with Lou sitting in the passenger seat. Once home, Andrea finds Lou lying on his bed, butt naked. N is for nudity, 5 points. He asks where she was, and Lou claims that she was at home studying for a test. She kisses him, but he does not reciprocate. He says that he'd called her home, and her mother claimed that she hadn't seen Lou in over a month. He slaps her. Typical 1970s Italian misogyny. Woman is slapped. 5 points. He calls her out for being in another man's car, and she sets the record straight that that is her brother. Andrea goes to leave, then asks what Walter does for a living, and Lou says that he races cars. Don't you know? Later that night, Andrea returns home, where he finds Lou laid out on the bed with her throat slit. She erupts with laughter, and Andrea expresses mild frustration with her, calling her an idiot. Typical 1970s Italian misogyny. Woman is called an idiot. 3 points. Sure, it's in jest, but yeah. The mood changes. The two play around, wrestling. Lou pulls Andrea's shirt off, and he chases her around the bed. Andrea tackles Lou to the bed and asserts his dominance by rubbing his mustache all over her face, marking his scent on her, signaling to the other males. Cut to some fast-forwarded POV shots of a race car going around a track. Reckless driving or circuit racing. 5 points. Andrea speaks with Walter, who quickly picks up on the former's ruse of him being a sports reporter. Andrea asks Walter what he does when he's not racing and what he did last Tuesday. Walter says he came in second in a race, then attended a party. He says he returned at 3 a.m. with friends. Andrea seems satisfied and leaves. Walter immediately uses a payphone and calls up Dr. Beanie. Next, Andrea visits Grove, where he questions John Lubbock. Lubbock says that he's read Andrea's article and that the reporters are better than the police, although he took issue with one thing. Before he can explain, Edward stops by, and there's a harsh glance from John. He asks if they can speak elsewhere in private. In the car now, John tells Andrea that he doesn't believe that his assailant's motive was robbery, but rather that John was intended to be the first victim. He expresses remorse for Sophia, then states that he hopes that his attacker is satisfied with reducing John into this state, but he doubts it, revealing that he has been receiving numerous phone calls with no one there, and that he feels convinced that the assailant will return to finish him off. Andrea asks if the police know, but John says what good would they be able to do? He considers going to his embassy. Later, Andrea is writing up his next news story. He is interrupted by the phone, but when he answers it, the voice on the other end is the enigmatic and distorted voice of the killer, who warns him that he's playing a dangerous game, poking his nose around. Extra points for T is for telephone, for the killer making a call. 5 more points. We overhear another narration of the killer's audio diary, as they reveal that the police are incompetent, but that the link tying the murders together, the glove, has been noted, and finally, that they have selected both their next victim and the way in which they will be dispatched. At the office, Andrea is forewarned again by the secretary that his boss has been waiting for him for over an hour and that it is a bad day for Andrea. As superfluous as this all seems, all of this horoscope and star talk will come up again. Consider the Italian title, which translates as Black Day for Aries. The chief tells Andrea that he is being taken off of the story due to issues brought up by Inspector Haller. Vogel pops in momentarily to inform the chief that, quote, they are ready. Andrea protests, but the chief asserts that he is the boss and that Andrea has already been replaced. Andrea storms out and bursts into Traversi's office to give him an earful. He accuses the newspaper of working with Dr. Beanie, who is one of their major backers, as well as Beanie inheriting a substantial amount after his wife's demise. Traversi spits back that this is all Andrea's fault for ruffling too many feathers and for losing his touch as a reporter and becoming sloppy, but Andrea responds that he may have become a piece of shit, but that Traversi has always been a bastard who sold his soul long ago. Andrea is now drowning his sorrows in hard alcohol. Gee, I wonder what he'll do immediately following this, if he'll go and pester someone. Cut to Helena coming home when she is stopped by a drunken Andrea. She attempts to dismiss him, but he's persistent. She agrees to talk in her car. Andrea admits that he is beginning to hate Traversi because he reminds Andrea of his own father, while Helena warns Andrea that he fears he'll become him and that his drinking will only make things worse. She asks him what about leaving the paper to become a traveling correspondent like he'd talked about. And he brings up how she once said that she would travel with him. Tony's bedroom light instigates Helena to leave, but Andrea grabs her and lays the smooches on her, which she reciprocates.
I like that his kissing style is to shove the entire woman in his mouth.
She says that she'll call him and finally goes inside. We watch as Traversi exits his office late at night. He passes through a park in the wee early hours of the morning. As Traversi ambles along, he is soon spied upon and followed. Traversi, despite looking around, cannot see anyone, but he becomes paranoid and picks up the pace, but he is still followed. Then, BAM! K is for knives, 5 points. Traversi tries to stumble away, but it is unclear if he was actually attacked with the blade or if he's succumbing to a heart attack. The killer follows him while taunting him, calling out his name. Extra points for K is for knives, for the blade reflecting the light, 5 more points. Traversi becomes weak and falls to the ground. He tries to flag down bystanders, but he remains unseen and unheard. They leave just as he dies. Cut to a funeral with all the red herrings in attendance. Funeral scene, 2 points. P is for priest, 5 points. Isabel Lancia looks over at Andrea, and the two lock eyes. After the funeral, she tells him that she needs to speak to him later. This interaction is observed by Inspector Haller. We learn that Traversi did in fact die from a heart attack and was discovered with a glove missing 2 fingers. It becomes quickly apparent that, again, Andrea does not have a solid alibi, as he claims after seeing Helena briefly, he returned home, but Lou was not there to corroborate this. Inspector Haller lays it out. Andrea is the only person who knows all of the victims and has been unable to provide an alibi in any of the 3 attacks. However, they don't have any evidence to convict him. Andrea asks how Haller found out about his recent argument with Traversi, and he says someone called him. Andrea asks, man or woman? And Haller says, man. Now, with Helena, Andrea discusses with her his theory of the killer, assuming that they are using the tunnel attacker on John Lubbock as a scapegoat for their murders, which logically would mainly benefit only one person. Helena posits that Andrea could alternatively be made out to be a scapegoat, for he had the most to gain by Traversi's death because he will likely take his position at the newspaper. Andrea says that he has a suspect in mind. Just then we see Tony running joyfully over to Helena and Andrea. Cut to Dr. Beanie heading out in his car. Andrea begins tailing behind him. Andrea watches as Ricardo picks up Walter and the two drive off. Urban locales, 2 points. He follows them to a secluded villa. Inside, he sees Ricardo with a room full of others merely lounging about. Walter gets up and the lights go down. A naked woman walks in. Walter meets her in the center and they start kissing. V is for voyeur, 5 points. The two move to the bed. The young woman is Giulia Soavi. As the two get hot and heavy, we see a man filming them. Oral, 7 points. And hell, while we're here, aardvarking, 10 points. Back home, Andrea finds Lou peering out through the blinds. For some reason, she has a wig on, and she says that she was interrogated about her relationship with Andrea by police all day. She points out that there are 2 cops outside guarding Andrea's house. They change the subject. Lou says that this is her last visit because she's getting married in a few days, but Andrea either doesn't believe her or is just humoring her. She says that Andrea has already moved on because some woman called for him earlier today, one Isabel Lancia. In order to avoid the police following him, Andrea says he'll sneak out, but Lou offers to drop him off. And I think I now get why she's wearing the wig. U is for undercover, 5 points. Outside the hotel, Andrea says that he will be right back. He passes through the lobby and up into her room. It's seemingly empty aside from a still burning cigarette. He looks around and finds Isabel Lancia dead in the bathtub with a glove left on her body. Bathtub murder set piece, 7 points. And despite us not seeing the murder, let's add extra points for N is for nudity for someone being nude during their murder, 5 more points. Andrea returns to the car and asks Lou if she'll stay the night with him one final time. Clearly, our boy understands that he cannot afford to not have an alibi again. Later that night, the two overhear on the radio that Isabel Lancia was discovered by Edward Vermont strangled in her hotel room. Lou seems visibly disturbed as this is her actually learning about the murder. We see Andrea and Lou being questioned by Inspector Haller, and with her help, Andrea is finally able to provide an alibi against a murder. I'm going to say extra points for L is for lies for someone lying about their alibi. Ignore that it's reserved for the killer lying about their alibi. 5 more points. Andrea asks Lou why she lied for him, and she says it was her farewell present to him. Before she takes off, Lou says that she didn't ask him whether he killed Isabel because whatever he does is his own business. Walking with John Lubbock, Andrea asks him what he will do, and Lubbock replies that he will pack his bags and return to Sydney. The two talk over how the killer has been leaving notes for Lubbock and likely knows him well. Lubbock tells Andrea to keep the letter and he can give it to the police or print it in the paper or whatever. He claims the letter had no stamp and was placed into the school mailbox. John says that he's leaving this week because now that Isabel is dead, he has no reason to remain around. Cut to Andrea driving up to a prostitute and inquiring about Julia and where he can find her. This interaction is watched over by Julia's father. Andrea returns to the dilapidated house, but it appears vacant. Somebody is spying on 2 young people having sex under the bridge. The woman is Julia. The voyeur is her father. Behind him stands the killer. The 2 lovebirds finish their session, and the man, or the John, departs, but notices Julia's old man watching him as he leaves. Julia approaches a fire and warms up while taking a moment to herself, aided by a cigarette. The killer watches her as she grabs more firewood. In the end, the killer rushes out and slashes Julia's throat. We watch as Julia's father is arrested. Walter is then ambushed by Andrea, who aggressively questions him. Extra points for Q is for questions being yelled. Another 5 points. Walter threatens to call the police, but Andrea retorts that he'll personally deliver Walter to the police for exploitation of minors. After a few slapadoos, Andrea demands to know who Walter saw in the tunnel who had accosted John Lubbock, but Walter claims he did not see who it was. Walter finally relents and admits it was Julia's father. The old man attacked John, mistaking him for Walter himself. He adds that Julia had threatened to leave Walter if he told the police. Andrea accuses Walter of using Julia like a pimp and asks if Dr. Beanie pays him for any other services. He says no, just that, and adds that Julia's father is trying to blackmail Dr. Beanie and Edward Vermont, but he did not commit any of the murders. Andrea asks why Walter believes the old man is innocent of the murders, and Walter points out how every murder has occurred on a Tuesday, and Julia's father works at a truck driving job and is always gone on Tuesday with work and returns Wednesday evenings. However, last week, when Julia was killed, there was a workers' strike. This would explain why we saw him there, but the point being made by Walter is that it is doubtful for us to assume that he committed the previous murders. Andrea questions Dr. Beanie and threatens to publish his story, which would smear the doctor. Andrea calls Ricardo out for his private get-togethers, and Dr. Beanie agrees to allow the papers to go back to covering the murders in their publications. After Dr. Beanie excuses himself, we see him call up Edouard for some urgent business. At the airport, Andrea shows Helena the story he plans to publish tomorrow. She warns him that his targets are bigger than him, but he is not afraid. She explains how she'll be away tonight, attending to matters with lawyers and her separated husband. Andrea feels that there's something that links all the murders, but cannot guess what it is. She tells Andrea that she'd keep an eye on Edouard. Airplane, 2 points. Helena says that she will be back around 9 o'clock, or so she hopes, but today is Tuesday, and things rarely go her way on Tuesdays. However, in the English dub, she says that she ran into Andrea's horoscope-obsessed secretary, and the woman had warned her that today will not be her day. We watch as Andrea is pulled in for further questioning. Haller accuses Andrea of searching for Julia hours before her murder. Andrea asks if Haller really thinks that her killer would have gone around inquiring about his future victim before killing them. He pleads with Haller for 24 hours, and he will solve the murder. Let's add useless police, 2 points. He's essentially doing their job. Haller asks Andrea why he simply doesn't just work for them, but he claims that his scoop means a lot to him. While lying in bed, Andrea suddenly realizes that all the murders were committed on a Tuesday, and Helena had a bad feeling about today because it is a Tuesday. We watch Andrea go through the annals of attacks, and this is the strangest thing for me in this movie. Let me ask you, what do you feel the timeline is of this movie? They haven't said anything in regards to time, but if you asked me, I'd wager that this is all happening days apart, or at least within the span of a month. Well, as he recites the readings aloud in his head, we learn that these murders all occurred about a month apart from each other. January, February, March, April, and May. Andrea goes into the secretary's room, which, by the way, I have no idea what her job is. I just keep saying secretary, and finds a book on astrology. In the book, it says that Tuesday is Mars's day and is favorable to people under the sign Aries. Andrea goes to make a call. We aren't positive of who he is calling, but we can see an audio recording device sitting beside the telephone. Clearly, the house of the killer. We see someone's POV snooping around a dark room using a flashlight. Hey, look, pornography. It's Andrea. He snoops around before finally discovering the same audio device. Cut to Tony in bed, hearing the telephone ring. He goes to answer it. It's his mother, Helena, who explains that her flight has been delayed and that she will be on the next flight out. Helena asks to speak to the maid, Elsa, but Tony says that she's not there. She was summoned to the airport after a telephone call. Helena is gripped with fear and warns Tony to follow her instructions and to lock the house and the garden and to not let anyone in. Tony has her hold as he goes to lock the house down. The door to the backyard is open, which doesn't raise any red flags for Tony, who closes it, then turns on heavy-duty metal shutters to close behind the doors. Remember, this is one of my favorite scenes in giallo, and this entire scene I find to be expertly done and to be truly frightening. Tony walks throughout the house, locking up the windows behind metal shutters. Every room could be hiding the killer in shadows, and with every shutter that closes, the defenseless Tony is further trapping himself inside the house with the killer and locking out any hope of a swift rescue. Tony returns to the phone, but the dialogue is interrupted by something shattering somewhere in the house. Suddenly, all the power goes out, the lights and the telephone line. Tony walks through the dark and hears another sound. He follows it, calling out to Elsa. He is stopped in his tracks by the sound of Pop Goes the Weasel playing in the distance. It's hard to discern the layout of the house in darkness, but it seems to be coming from the basement. Tony enters the room and approaches the music box, but BAM! The killer slams the door behind him shut. The boy screams and flees. A flashlight turns on and follows Tony, who escapes into another room, locks it, and runs to the other side. There's nowhere to go, unfortunately.
Close up on a door handle, 5 points.
The door rattles and finally bursts open. The killer approaches Tony, hands forward, closer and closer. But Andrea comes to the rescue. They scuffle, then the killer escapes down the hall. Andrea gives chase, but the killer surprises him around the corner with a straight razor, which slices into him. As the killer flees, the lights come on, and Elsa walks in. I will point out, how the hell did Andrea get inside? How did Elsa get the lights back on? How did she get inside? Don't ruin it, Tanner. The sequence has been too good. The chase scene is pretty extended. I'll add some music to help speed things along. He follows the killer inside this old building. After seemingly losing the killer, Andrea spies them, and the chase continues. Andrea catches up to them, and they have another scuffle utilizing these amazing shots with all these swinging lamps. The killer breaks free and gets some ground between them and Andrea. Then the blade comes out. Window smash! The killer hops out and runs along the perimeter. Andrea is never far behind, however. Check out these great stunts outside. Andrea traps the killer, smashes them through a window, and then tosses their ass off the scaffold. Andrea approaches the injured killer and rips their mask off, revealing John Lubbock. Hidden identity of the killer until the final moments, 5 points. The voiceover of Andrea reveals that John's only predestined victim was Isabel, whom he hated. All the others were distractions to hide his true motive, which was that he was in love with Edward Vermont ever since they had first taught together in Sydney. Queer character, gay man, 5 points. John Lubbock was an Aries, in fact, as his birthday is stated in an earlier scene, but I did not mention that because it would have seemed a bit telling if I did. John's assault in the tunnel was the only attack to not occur on a Tuesday. Inside his home, Andrea found the tape recorder with his detailed confession of everything, including who his next victim would be, Helena's child. As John Lubbock is hauled off to jail, he locks eyes with Edward Vermont, who stares daggers into him. Then he locks eyes with Andrea, who likewise stares through him. The police car drives off, the camera fades a bit, then goes to full blackout. Let's quickly add up some final cliches. S is for secrets. Extra points for the killer having an impossible to predict motivation, 10 points. And someone else is believed to be the killer or mistaken identity, for Mr. Suave being arrested and held, 5 points. I think that's it. And unfortunately, the movie is going to miss out on several points for them not killing off the killer, nor having him die when he fell. And that's the fifth chord. Great giallo. Sure, it's not perfect. Like I said, that amazing sequence is a bit undercut when you think about how two people managed to enter the house after it was locked down like Fort fucking Knox. Also, I do think the killer's motive kind of comes out of left field, but John Lubbock himself being the killer could be theoretically pieced together, but it seems like him being attacked in the tunnel worked out a little too conveniently for him to use as a cover. Despite these criticisms, the movie is really great. The scenes are framed very well and are gorgeous, and the movie is lacking in many of the goofy aspects that plague too many of Argento's films. The Italian dub, by the way, is also much better than the English dub. Let's segue to the GialliTally cliches for this movie. Post-giallo viewing cliches. The reason for the killing. Obsession, 7 points. I think I made a mistake in the overview, insinuating that the motivation was a soon-to-be overused cliche, which I must have forgotten that Lubbock's motive was being spurned, versus I think I must have misremembered it at the time as being sexual perversion. Whoopsie! The reason for the investigation. Reporter, 5 points, and extra points for the sleuth being an amateur detective, 5 more points. Bonus points. The style bonus. The movie is very stylish and in a way that doesn't seem over the top or draw too much attention to itself. Bazzoni is truly great at utilizing style in such a way. We have a few well-placed crash zooms and POV shots. Several of these shots also utilize a lens that I'm not sure of the technical name for it. I want to say fisheye lens, but I don't think that's exactly what that is. Colored lights are all naturally used and add atmosphere. We have great use of mirrors and reflections. We receive this stuttering effect when Julia is killed. There's some good focus racks and fades, and we have a fast mo. Again, not sure if that's what you'd call it, but the sequence with the race car POV is sped up for dramatic effect. Like I said, my description of the style would sound like an Umberto Lenzi over-the-top or Bava style heavy type movie, but they're all used in such a smart way. Out of a max of 25 points possible, I will give the fifth chord 22 points for its style bonus. Soundtrack, Yes, 15 points. Bad effects? I don't think so. I think Bazzoni avoids showing things on film if the final result isn't going to look good. No points. Final look, extra points. The Deadpool tallying how many kills and deaths are featured in the film. I break it down as thus: 10 points per kill or death seen for the main Deadpool, plus any stylistic kill multipliers, which we didn't add yet, plus the knife kill bonus. We have Sophia Beanie, strangled and then thrown down onto the stairs. I think she's dead before she goes over the landing, so let's say choked with hands, 12 points. Traversi, heart attack, 10 points. Isabel Lancia, it's off screen, so we don't know if she was strangled or drowned, 10 points. And Giulia Soavi, throat slit with a straight razor, 17 points. Extended Deadpool for those other deaths mentioned but not seen, I'll give 3 points for each. We don't have any. Red herrings for the total number of legitimate suspects in the film, 5 points per legit suspect are awarded. We have Edouard Vermont, Dr. Riccardo Bini, Walter Auer, Mr. Soave, Helena, Isabel Lancia, and Andrea. Now, I can justify most of these people being suspected. Despite Walter clearly not being the assailant in the tunnel, it becomes clear at a point that the killer is probably not the same individual. And Andrea covers for Helena at one point, which could suggest that she might be the killer, but probably not. And Andrea himself, though very implausible, could be suspected early on. I mean, he's conveniently blackout drunk during numerous of the attacks. Anyways, 35 points. Flashback sequences, 5 points each. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11,
12, 13, and 14. 70 points for flashbacks.
Nudity. I award 5 points for ass, 7 for breasts, and 10 for genitalia. We have
Ass and breasts.
breasts, ass and breasts, although it's dark. Ass, breasts, breasts. Don't hate me for counting these. Ass, breasts, 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 and breasts.
81 points for nudity.
Ladies and gentlemen, for the fifth chord, I awarded the film an AZ score of 19 out of 26. With the bonus points for these, we have a modified score total of
150 points.
And for the full GialliTally score, I award the fifth chord a GialliTally score of
661 points.
Compared to The Case of the Bloody Iris in first with 830 points, Slaughter Hotel in second with 827 points, and A Lizard in a Woman's Skin in third with 759 points. The fifth chord is in seventh place
with 661 points. I predicted 650 to 700 points, and I got it. I nailed it. I'm happy. That's all I got to say.
This one for a while had me concerned that it wasn't going to get 600, but thanks to some nudity in a brief pass of a dirty magazine, the movie crossed the line. Actually, it would have crossed 600 without that even. But like I say, these points do not mean a movie is better or worse. Please like this video, share it with your friends if they are horror fans or cinephiles, subscribe to The King in Giallo if you haven't yet, and if you have any questions, thoughts, curiosities, or concerns, leave those below in the comments section and I will get back to you. Give The King in Giallo a follow on Instagram and perhaps a like on Facebook. Subscribe to The King in Giallo Patreon to see early access to my videos, with some videos able to be seen up to a month in advance, plus exclusive content found only there, such as the viewings, the Rat Hole Burn movie reviews, the King in Giallo podcast, the Giallo adjacent podcasts, the Giallo Reads book reviews, and plenty more. Next time on The King in Giallo, I will be going back and covering a Giallo film from 1971 that I glossed over. This will be the overview, review, and GialliTally for the only Giallo film from Enzo G. Castellari, The Cold Eyes of Fear. Thank you very much for your continued support. This is Tanner Leeser for The King in Giallo, and if nothing else, I'll see you next time.